History isn't just about learning what happened, it's also about unlearning stories that never did. If you've watched enough cartoons, movies, or comic strips, you have probably seen this image before. A caveman spots a woman. He decides she is his. He hits her over the head with a club. Then he drags her to his cave, sometimes by the hair, sometimes by throwing her over his shoulder. And somehow, by the end of the scene, she's in love with him. This is one of the oldest and most recognizable tropes in popular culture. Anthropologists call this Courtship by Club. And for more than a century, this image has been presented as something primitive, natural, and deeply human, with the clear implication that men have always been aggressive and women have always been passive. The implication that human relationships have always been built on male dominance and female submission. But there's only one problem. As far as historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists can tell, none of this actually happened. The iconic caveman dragging a woman away isn't part of our ancient history. It's actually a modern myth. And like many myths, it tells us far more about the people who invented it than it tells us anything about the past itself. My name is Kaylee, and in this video we are going to explore where this courtship by club myth came from, why it became so popular, and how a Victorian theory with almost no evidence behind it helped shape modern ideas about masculinity, femininity, and human nature. This video is sponsored by UPDF, but as always, more on the sponsor later in the video. So I recently made a video about a recent study that figured out that Neanderthal men and Homo sapiens women interbred the most, and not the other way around. And the comments on that video were fueled by the courtship by club myth, as you can clearly see on screen. And that's not taking the comments on my other socials where I shared this video as well into account. I had hundreds. Because of all these comments that I received on that video and that topic, I was thinking about making a video on this stereotype. But as per usual, I got a little bit sidetracked into making other videos. Yeah, it's called ADD, I cannot focus on one thing. But then I came across a video on TikTok by Pop Detective, otherwise known as Pop Culture Detective on YouTube, that was uploaded on June 3rd, that looked into caveman masculinity and the courtship by club visual gag and its origins. So that inspired me to look into the origins of courtship by club myself and to do my own research and share my findings with you in this video. You know that feeling when you open a 60-page archaeology paper and think, how do I turn this into a story you'll actually want to watch? That's basically where every episode of this channel begins. Buried under dense academic PDFs, technical language, and sometimes scans of documents that look like they've survived a few centuries themselves. So lately, I've been using UPDF to turn that research mountain into something that's manageable. Let me show you what I mean. I'll start by dropping in a full academic report, something like a recent excavation study. Normally I would spend hours pulling out the key points, but with UPDF's AI assistant, I can instantly summarize the main findings and chronology, so I get the narrative backbone in seconds instead of days. Now, this is where it gets really useful. A lot of historical material isn't even searchable. It's just scanned images. With the OCR feature, UPDF converts this into real, editable text. Suddenly, I can search for dates, names, or locations that were basically locked away before. And this is my new favorite feature, AI bookmarks. With one click, it builds a full outline of the document, even if it's messy or stitched together from multiple sources. Then I can right-click any section and get a targeted summary for just that chapter. It's perfect when you're dealing with massive, chaotic files and need to jump straight to what matters. Plus, everything syncs across my devices, so I can annotate or review research on my tablet when I'm traveling or visiting historical sites. So yeah, this is basically how I turn dense academic research into the stories you see here. If you want to try it yourself, you can download UPDF from the link in the description and see how it works into your workflow. Thanks UPDF for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back into it. So I've been very inspired by pop culture detective. Thank you for the inspiration. And yeah, let's get into it. So it is very clear that in the year of 2026, the courtship by club myth is still very prevalent and is still used to portray male dominance and female submission. The caveman stereotype is instantly recognizable. He is physically powerful, emotionally simple, he's violent, territorial, and obsessed with women. Our popular culture presents him as the ultimate alpha male. This image appears everywhere, in cartoons, sitcoms, advertising campaigns, children's books, comics, and even in relationship advice. For generations, we were told that this is simply how men are wired, that the aggressive pursuit is just hardwired into male biology, that dominance is natural, and that violence is this ancient and intrinsic thing that men have. And when someone ends up questioning these assumptions, someone inevitably says, well, that's just how cavemen were. But where did this idea actually come from? Because it didn't come from archaeological evidence, nor did it come from anthropological research. And there is no evidence for this in the actual prehistoric record. Now, the origins of this idea come from quite a specific source, a Victorian intellectual movement that attempted to explain human society through grand theories of social evolution, and at the center of this story is a man named John Ferguson McLennan. The origins of courtship by club are surprisingly well documented, and contrary to what you may have heard in the past, it's not just one person who literally single-handedly invented the image of cavemen capturing women. Now, the stories of bride capture, abduction, and forced marriage had already existed in folklore, mythology, and literature for centuries. But in the 19th century, there was one man who tried to transform these stories into scientific history. And unfortunately, he was very successful in this endeavor. This person was a Scottish lawyer by the name of John Ferguson McLennan. He was born in 1827 and he was educated as a lawyer. And he had not studied archaeology or any other education that specializes in prehistoric societies. Just, clarify. Unfortunately, he became one of the most influential thinkers in the emerging field of anthropology after he published a book called Primitive Marriage, an inquiry into the origin of the form of capture in marriage ceremonies, in 1865. This book had an enormous influence on how people imagined relationships in prehistoric times. McLennan had noted that some marriage ceremonies around the world included symbolic rituals that could resemble kidnapping, where a bride might pretend to resist, a groom may have to ceremonially capture her, family members might have staged a mock pursuit. Anthropologists today have an understanding that rituals may have many different meanings and often survive long after their original context had disappeared. But McLennan in 1865 reached a far more dramatic conclusion. He argued that these ceremonies were cultural fossils, which survived from a prehistoric age when men literally captured women from neighboring groups and took them as wives. The actual evidence for his theory was incredibly thin. There were no prehistoric written records, there were no archaeological discoveries that proved widespread marriage by capture, and there was no way to actually directly observe the societies that he was describing because, they had all long since died. People don't survive for 30,000 years? But what McLennan did to, quote-unquote, prove his theory was piecing together examples from different cultures all across different continents from different times, and then use this to reconstruct an imaged prehistoric past. A past that never truly existed. However, the readers from the Victorian era who read his book felt like his theory was very convincing. It appeared scientific and thus evolutionary. And worst of all, it seemed to explain why men and women occupied different positions in society. Soon after the book was published, this idea of courtship by club and marriage by capture spread far beyond the general readers and academic circles. The image of primitive men seizing women by force spread quickly to writers, artists, advertisers, filmmakers, and cartoonists, who all embraced it. And after a couple of decades, A speculative Victorian theory gradually transformed into one of the most recognizable stereotypical images in popular culture. The caveman with a club, women being dragged by the hair or carried over his shoulder, the assumption that male domination wasn't cultural, but ancient and inevitable. So what began as a controversial 19th century theory with no actual basis slowly became something much more powerful, and it's a story that people mistook for actual history. But to understand why this theory spread so far and so quick, we need to understand Victorian society. The mid to late 19th century was a period of enormous social change, where women were increasingly demanding more rights. Like, for instance, the right for education, the right to own property, the right to participate in public life, the right to divorce, and the right to vote. These demands by women threatened the traditional assumptions about gender, and whenever social hierarchies are challenged, people often look for more ways to make these hierarchies seem more natural. And that is exactly where these courtship by club and marriage by capture stories about prehistory become very useful for those who didn't want women to have these basic human rights. Because if the men could claim that male dominance goes all the way back to the cavemen, then suddenly inequality doesn't look like a social construct. Instead, it looks like nature itself. And the message becomes, this isn't oppression, this is biology. This is how humans have always lived, and thus, you need to simply just accept it. Courtship by Club fit perfectly into that worldview and was an incredible tool for men to keep trying to oppress women. The caveman became a political argument which was disguised as being part of history. Thankfully today, archaeologists have a much better understanding of prehistoric societies than the people in the Victorian era did, and the evidence simply doesn't support the cartoon version of caveman life. Of course, that doesn't mean that violence never existed or never occurred. We all know that violence has existed as a part of our life throughout human history, just like coercion, warfare, and abuse. But that is not the same as claiming that women were routinely clubbed, unconscious, and dragged away as a standard form of courtship. Because there's simply no known archaeological evidence demonstrating that this was a universal or defining mating strategy by humans. What archaeologists are able to find is far more complicated than the cartoon version of prehistory. For much of the 20th century, popular culture imagined our ancestors as living in simple male-dominated bands where aggressive men hunted and fought while passive women stayed behind, gathered food, and raised the children. But the evidence increasingly points to a much more diverse picture. Prehistoric societies varied enormously across time and geography. Human beings lived in thousands of different communities spread across every continent and tens of thousands of years. There was no single caveman lifestyle, and there certainly wasn't a universal model of relationships between men and women. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, which provide some of our best comparisons for understanding the deep past, reveal a remarkable variety of social arrangements. Some societies are more egalitarian than others. Some emphasize cooperation between extended families. Some practice monogamy, while others permit multiple partners. Decision-making authority can be distributed on very different ways depending on the culture. Even the old stereotype of man the hunter has come under increasing scrutiny. Archaeological discoveries have identified women buried with hunting tools, while ethnographic research has shown that women in many foraging societies actively participated in hunting, food gathering, resource management, and community leadership. Rather than a rigid division between dominant men and submissive women, the evidence often points towards systems built around cooperation, complementary and mutually beneficial to their society. So if a woman was really good at hunting, and a man was really good at finding those perfect berries and plants, she would have hunted and he would have gathered. Simple as that. It depends on what your society, your culture, your community needs, and what you can provide for them. Human mating strategies appear to have been equally diverse. Anthropologists have found evidence for long-term pair bonding, cooperative child-rearing, extensive kin networks, and shared parental investment. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of our species may be our unusual reliance on cooperation. Human children require years of care, and throughout much of our evolutionary history, that burden was rarely carried by mothers alone. Fathers, grandparents, siblings, and other community members frequently played important roles in raising children, not just the mothers. None of this means prehistoric societies were perfect or free from violence. Conflict, inequality, and coercion certainly existed. But the archaeological record does not support the simplistic image of a universal caveman patriarchy in which men routinely clubbed women into submission, where women were just, raising the children and gathering berries. What the evidence reveals instead is diversity. Different societies, different family structures, different gender roles, different ways of organizing relationships and raising children. The familiar caveman stereotype collapses all of that complexity into a single story and then mistakes that story for human nature itself. And there is actually a very useful term for this phenomenon: paleofantasy. Okay, cool word, but what does it actually mean? A paleofantasy is a modern belief that is being projected backwards onto prehistory. So instead of learning about the past from evidence, we use the past as a screen onto which we project our assumptions, so the caveman becomes whatever we want him to be. So if we believe that men are naturally violent, the caveman becomes violent. If we believe that women are naturally submissive, the caveman becomes dominant and the woman becomes more compliant and docile, obedient and dutiful. If we believe that hierarchy is inevitable, cavemen become hierarchical. And thus, the prehistoric world becomes less of a place of discovery and evidence-based research and more of a mirror that reflects our own biases. And that is exactly what happened with Courtship by Club. Victorian assumptions about gender were projected backwards and then presented to the public as ancient truth, even though there was no evidence supporting any of these claims. And once this trope entered popular culture, it became self-reinforcing, because every generation saw it being repeated. Comic books repeated it, just as cartoons and movies and advertisements, and eventually the audience stopped asking if it was true because the image became so familiar, and familiarity has a strange power. The more often we see something, the more natural it feels. We take it at face value and stop asking more questions because we are so used to seeing and hearing it, so even when it is completely fictional, the trope has become common sense. And that is how myths survive. Not because they are supported by any evidence, but because they are repeated often enough that they become common sense. And when you look closely enough at the Courtship by Club trope, the disturbing part isn't just the violence, but it's also the punchline. Because in these stories, the woman almost always ends up liking it. She's grateful, flattered, attracted, and thus violence is transformed into romance. And this is also still pushed onto children as they grow up. How many girls have been told that if a boy is teasing them, pulling their hair, insulting them, or bullying them, it just means he likes her? The message is that boys express affection through aggression, and that girls should learn to tolerate that aggression because boys will be boys. In other words, boys are often excused for behavior that would otherwise be considered unacceptable, while girls are taught to reinterpret that behavior as a compliment. And instead of being encouraged to set boundaries, they are encouraged to be understanding. Instead of being told that respect is the foundation of healthy relationships, they are told that mistreatment can be a sign of attraction. And they wonder why so many women are being abused by their partners. I know. The Courtship by Club trope reflects the same underlying idea. It takes aggression and reframes it as romance. It suggests that violence, coercion, or domination are natural expressions of male desire, and that women secretly appreciate being controlled. No, we don't. We really don't. So the details may be exaggerated for comedy, but the message is familiar. Of course, this doesn't mean that every playground tease leads to something more serious, nor does it mean that every person who repeats these ideas intends harm. But cultural messages matter. The stories that we tell children help shape their expectations about relationships, consent, and acceptable behavior. When aggression is repeatedly framed as affection, it can blur the line between care and control, making it harder to recognize unhealthy dynamics later in life. What makes the Courtship by Club myth so culturally significant is that it doesn't simply tell a story about the distant past. It shapes the way people think about the present. On the surface, it's just a joke. A caveman clubs a woman over the head, drags her back to his cave, and somehow she falls in love with him. But beneath the humor is a much more powerful message. The trope takes aggression and reframes it as romance. It suggests that domination is a natural expression of male desire, that coercion can become affection, and that women ultimately want to be pursued, controlled, or won over through force. These ideas have appeared in countless forms throughout popular culture for generations. The caveman version is simply one of the most exaggerated and recognizable examples. By placing the behavior in prehistory, the trope gives itself a built-in justification. The implication is that this is how human beings have always behaved, that male aggression is natural and female acceptance is inevitable, and unequal power dynamics are simply part of our evolutionary heritage. And that is precisely why the myth has been so effective. If a behavior can be presented as ancient, it becomes easier to present it as normal. If it's normal, it becomes way easier to excuse. And if it's supposedly rooted in human nature itself, it becomes harder to question. But history and archaeology don't support that narrative. The evidence does not support to a single universal pattern of dominant men and submissive women stretching back to the dawn of humanity. Instead, it reveals an enormous diversity of social arrangements, family structures, and relationships across different cultures and different periods of prehistory. The Courtship by Club myth survives not because it tells us something meaningful about our ancestors, but because it reinforces assumptions that many societies have held about gender, power, and relationships. In that sense, it isn't really a story about the Stone Age at all. It's a modern ideology dressed up as ancient history. So this leaves me to ask you, what do you think of the Courtship by Club trope? Were you already familiar with its origins and how it shaped our view of the past? And what do you think we need to do to break this cycle of this trope returning into our modern media generation after generation? Let me know in the comments down below. I still want to invite you to Turkey to join me in September. We are going to see Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Sokmatar, Şuayip, Saybuç, Sefer Tepe. We're going on a boat tour on the Euphrates River. We're going to climb Mount Nemrut. We're going to see the bee houses and the University of Haran. And we're going into Cappadocia, the underground city of Kaymakli. You will see the ferry chimneys there. And we will end the tour at Hattusha with that green mysterious stone. You know, Hattusha, the capital of the Hittites. And that's near Ankara. And yeah, I would very much like it if you join me, because it's gonna be the trip of a lifetime. I launched a whole new merch line. It's called the Skull Collection. It's got all of these different skulls from different human species that have lived in the past. I did 5 human species, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, and Homo erectus. And I'm very proud of what the skull collection looks like. You can probably see it somewhere in the screen. But yeah, check it out. I'm very proud of it. I designed everything myself, as per usual. And yeah, if you enjoyed watching, then don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe if you like to see more of these kinds of videos, and click that bell icon if you want to be notified whenever I upload. If you haven't seen my previous videos yet, then don't make me cry into a corner, but just click the card in the upper right corner, or click one of the links in the description down below, or click a video in the end card. Or just go to my channel and see my latest upload, cause I've never had a video perform that poorly in the past 4 years. So I don't know what went wrong, maybe you just don't like that topic, but I expected more of you guys to like watch it. But with that said, I would like to thank my patrons and my channel members. Thank you so much for supporting me, truly. It means the world to me. And yeah, this is me blabbing in the middle of a heat wave. Yesterday we had thunderstorms and the sky was just flashing continuously for about 4 hours on end. Couldn't sleep because of that. And if you thought that the thunderstorm would kind of cool everything off in the Netherlands, no. The rain felt like standing in Satan's lukewarm piss. And I'm still standing inside Satan's butt crack at the moment. That's how it feels. It's so humid. Okay, so with that said, I will see you in the next video. I think I said everything. I got some new cute lights, as you can see. I'm trying to like make the office cuter. And yeah, okay, that's enough of me blabbing. I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.